Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We are in Parsha Behalotacha, but before I talk about that, I mentioned last night that this begins quite a few parshas that seem to show Bnei Yisrael in a downward spiral. Everything is going wrong, starting with this week, which makes for very dramatic and enjoyable reading, but can also be very discouraging when we take the messages in and the stories in. So hopefully, this is a way for us to learn from the mistakes of others so we don't have to repeat them ourselves in our own life. I call this parsha Complaints in Search of a Problem. So what do I mean by that? Abigail just chanted beautifully from the verses that actually included the high point in our parsha. But then immediately after that high point, we descend into chaos, madness, self-deception, deception of others, and everything starts to unravel pretty quickly. So the two verses that I'm talking about are very familiar to you. We chant them we used to chant them every week when we met in person. And here they are in Hebrew, and you'll recognize them. Vayehi b'nsuah ha'aron, vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai ve'afutzu oivecha ve'anusu misanecha mipanecha. So these are the two verses that we chant when we are in formation and in the synagogue, when we take the Torah scrolls out of the ark and we march around the congregation. So this is a simulation of what was happening in the desert after the Mishkan was built, and we were assigned our particular tasks around it and given a place for each tribe. So we've got the Mishkan that's assembled in the middle, and then we've got the 12 tribes around it, 3 tribes in each direction. And this was, as Rabbi Finley used to say, Jews on the march. So we simulate this in our service. The translation of those verses is, so it was whenever the ark set out, Moshe would say, "Arise, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and may those who hate you flee from you." And this is interesting because, ironically, in our parsha, we end up being the enemies who hate God and flee from God. And I'm going to talk about that and try to explain why and how everything goes so wrong. So right after this high point of those verses that I just chanted, everything goes wrong in a very dramatic fashion. The very next verse we read is, the people were seeking to make complaints, and it was evil in the ears of God. So the translation in the Stone Edition is, the people took to seeking complaints, but literally this verse, and I'm talking about 11:1 in our parsha, this verse can be translated as, and it was when the people were like complainers. Now, what does that mean? So regardless of which translation you read, there is a common understanding that the people created complaints and then found a problem to associate them with. So why would the people go out of their way to create problems and voice dissatisfactions, especially now, after reaching this wonderful high point in their journey? After all, they're on the brink of entering the promised land, the ultimate destination. And I think that it's that prospect, actually, that gives us the greatest clue. Up until now in our story, we have been concentrating on going away from something, away from Egypt, away from slavery, away from idol worship. Now we are faced with going towards something, a new adventure, towards Eretz Israel, towards freedom, towards responsibility, and of course, what goes with it, towards establishing a just society in a new land with laws and accountability. So we're at a threshold here, the wilderness of in between. We're in a state of incompleteness and transition, but we have to confront all the wild forces acting against us that will not be denied. I call the tohu vavohu of the midbar, of the desert. A lot of what I'm trying to explain here and teach is inspired and comes from Aviva Zornberg in her wonderful book on the Book of Numbers called Bewilderments, Reflections on the Book of Numbers, which I highly recommend. It's not as impenetrable as you may think, and it's definitely worth the effort to read it and understand it. So she explores these psychological issues of facing this threshold and being in this in-between state. Let me set the stage a little bit. We've been at Mount Sinai. We're still at Mount Sinai. We've been there for somewhere between 10 and 13 months, and we're finally moving out towards Eretz Israel. Now, what have we been doing for the 10 to 13 months? Well, we've built the Mishkan. We've witnessed the appointment of the Kohanim. But mostly, we're learning the Torah that was taught to Moshe and that he in turn is teaching to us. So the reality of what's coming next, this crossing over to the promised land with the battles that we've been promised that will happen and all the responsibilities, is overwhelming and frightening. We do not want this yoke of Torah. We don't want the responsibility of freedom. We want the security of slavery. And because we're ashamed to voice that particular fear, or perhaps because we even lack self-awareness to even understand that this is part of what our fear and anxiety is, we complain in a vague and non-specific way. We subscribe to a false narrative, that is, how good we had it in Egypt. We distort memory and reality. Finally, the vague and non-specific complaints are concretized. We finally find a direction for them, a name for them. The rabble, which Abigail also chanted about, you'll recognize the words Asaf Suf, which is translated as the rabble. They cultivated a craving. Once again, by this use of the word cultivating, there's an implication that there wasn't a craving before, there wasn't a desire before until we went out and looked for one. And we said, who will feed us meat? So what follows is a ridiculous fantasy of how good it was in Egypt and the delicious delicacies that we ate on a regular basis. The Torah tells us that this complaint started with this rabble, the Asaf Suf, who are also referred to as the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude. And who is this group? We understand it to be those people who left Egypt with the Israelites, but who were not part of Bnei Yisrael, perhaps wanting to escape slavery, but not necessarily committed to the covenant. In this way, and this is the important idea here, we are introduced to the idea that even those who have the lowest status among us, who may not even be part of the covenant, perhaps not even committed to God or the mitzvot, could nevertheless exercise tremendous influence and sway the people away from the truth, away from God, away from faith, and from the ways in which we had been instructed. This insidious influence of complaining started with the least among us in the community, and by the end of our parsha, it has already spread like an infection all the way up to Aaron and Miriam. As I mentioned last night when I shared this wonderful midrash about what happened to Moshe in the 60 years between when he fled Egypt and finally ended up in Midian and was called by God, that it was all based on this one verse at the end of our parsha, which basically says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe about the Cushite woman that he had been married to. I'm not going to go into what that was all about, but it really was a wonderful fairy tale that has been woven by the people who create the Midrashim. And the Midrash, you should know, the Midrashim are really the oldest commentaries on the Bible. the legends and midrashim are the first commentary, and then our sages come in later and collect them or comment on them or incorporate them into their own commentary on the Torah. So these are some of the oldest stories that we have about the Bible. But in any event, my point is that the dissatisfaction started within the lowest among us, those who we would think would have the least influence. And this infection spread all the way up to the people at the top of the hierarchical pyramid, all the way up to Miriam and Aaron. So there's a lesson there. You may think that you could be impervious to the influence of people who do not have status or that you would normally disregard, but that influence could be felt nevertheless. So don't underestimate the power of this kind of insidious talk affecting those who are in power and who have much influence. I said that this was the first parsha that explains and gives us the story of a downward spiral. The next few parsha, we'll see the opposite sequence, meaning how an infection of fear, anxiety, and dissatisfaction spreads from the top down. So for example, we know that the leaders are sent out in our next parsha, Parsha Shlach Lecha. The leaders of each tribe are sent out to scout out the land, and they come back with a false report or a mixture of truth and falsehood. But in any event, they give it a spin to where it causes despair and fear with the people. So this is an example of how that kind of language can infect people from the top down. Same with the story of the Korach rebellion. Korach occupied a lofty position, and he was also able to influence people from the top down and spur a rebellion against Moshe and Aaron. So we've got a few very dramatic stories coming up, which I will have the privilege of explaining and talking about. But here, like I said, this malicious influence spreads from the bottom up. So why were we so susceptible to their influence? It seems that after building the Mishkan and being organized according to our tribal affiliation and understanding what our responsibilities were, that the center could not hold, that the lesser angels of our nature once again took hold and emerged as baseless complaints. We're on the brink of entering the land, but uncertainty, anxiety, and despair take over. The weight of the next mission was overwhelming. Zornberg also introduces another idea that is very interesting, which she calls our original sin. Now, we may think of the term original sin as a Christian concept, but Zornberg talks about a sin that precedes the obvious sins in our parsha. And what are the obvious sins in our parsha? The sin of complaining and complaining against God, and the sin of desire for what we don't have and what we gave up. So this yearning to go back to Egypt. So those are the two obvious sins. But Zornberg, citing the Ramban, Nachmanides, explains that the original sin of the Israelites was their running away from the mountain of God, from Sinai. Now you may say, this doesn't really make sense. After all, I just told you that they were there at Mount Sinai for anywhere from between 10 to 13 months. So how can we interpret their action as running away? So I'll explain via the Ramban. He quotes the Talmud and says that this particular pasuk, talking about the people leaving Mount Sinai, teaches us that they turned aside from following God. That's a lot to read into the verse, but it makes sense in light of the rest of what I'm going to explain. And he quotes a midrash that we can all identify with. Here's the quote. Bnei Yisrael traveled away from Mount Sinai gleefully like a child who runs away from school, saying, perhaps God will give us more commandments if we stay. So we've got this image of when they're finally given permission to leave, running away from Mount Sinai because they're afraid if they stay any longer, there'll be more commandments that they have to learn, more restrictions on their behavior, more things that they have to do. The Ramban goes on and says, this is the meaning of the expression, and they traveled away from the mountain of God. Their intention was to remove themselves from there because it was the mountain of God. This is the first sin. Possibly, if it had not been for this sin, God would have brought them into the land immediately. So Zornberg explains this innocent and impairing act of traveling away is really an act of abandonment and betrayal. For example, you may know that there is a custom in synagogue, perhaps to counteract this particular interpretation in the Talmud, that when we are called up to the bima for an aliyah, that we should hastily run up to the bima, showing our enthusiasm for being near to God and to the Torah. And likewise, there's a custom to show our reluctance to leave that position after our aliyah has ended, so we stay up for the next person's aliyah. So I think there is a connection here. So what is this idea of turning toward versus turning away? I think it has another prominent place in Torah. You'll remember that after we're introduced to Moshe in Sefer Shemot, he has the encounter with the taskmaster beating the Israelite slave, resulting in Moshe killing the taskmaster and having to flee from Egypt. He goes to Midian and he's welcomed there in the home of Yitro, the Midianite priest, and eventually marries Yitro's daughter, Zipporah. But interestingly, Moshe has his own story involving the wilderness, the Midbar, and in fact, it's named Midbar in this particular story at the beginning of Shemot. And this all happens before leading the Israelites out from Egypt. It's the famous story of Moshe and the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. So we read, and I'll quote, Moshe was shepherding the sheep of Yitro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. He guided the sheep far into the wilderness, the Midbar, and he arrived at the mountain of God toward Horeb. So he arrived at the same mountain where we are all now in our point in Torah and in the wilderness. So just as Moshe was at the mountain of God by himself, we are now at the mountain of God, about to walk towards the promised land. And then I'll continue on with the quotation. An angel of Hashem appeared to him in a blaze of fire from amid the bush. He saw, and behold, the bush was burning in the fire, but the bush was not consumed. Moshe thought, I will turn aside now and look at this great sight. Why will the bush not be burned? Then the next verse is, Hashem saw that he turned aside to see, and God called out to him from amid the bush and said, Moshe, Moshe. And he replied famously, Hineni, here I am. So why am I connecting this episode of the burning bush with what's going on with the Israelites now? There seems to be a direct connection between Moshe's turning aside to look at the side of the burning bush and God calling out to him. Why would that be so? Well, the act of turning toward implies courage, a willingness to face reality and to face one's fears. On the other hand, in our Parsha, in the most subtle way, we see that the Israelites turn away from the mountain of God, similar to what we read in Parshat Yitro during the revelation at Sinai. So here's another example of the choice being made to turn towards versus turning away. And I'm going to read from Yitro. Yitro is the Parsha that contains the revelation, the 10 Commandments. The entire people saw the thunder and the flames, the sound of the shofar and the smoking mountain. The people saw and trembled and stood from afar. They said to Moshe, you speak to us and we shall hear. Let God not speak to us lest we die. Moshe said to the people, do not fear, for in order to elevate you has God come, so that awe of him shall be upon your faces, so that you shall not sin. The people stood from afar, and Moshe approached the thick cloud where God was. Now, I've always read these verses with a little bit of sadness and disappointment, and an idea that this was a huge missed opportunity, the lost opportunity to have this direct experience with God. So the people let their fear and anxiety get in the way of having this experience, as opposed to Moshe at the burning bush, who turned towards this experience and was rewarded by God calling out to him. The Ramban continues with an additional harsh critique of the people. As mentioned before, the literal translation of the first part of chapter 11, verse 1, which is Vayehi ha'am k'mitonim, could be, and it was, that the people were like complainers, focusing on this preposition, which is translated as like or as. The Ramban contends that the people were only pretending to complain, that they were actors complaining, implied by this preposition, with some people merely acting like people in distress, deceiving others into thinking they were being sincere, while some were victims, most likely, of their own self-deception. Regardless, Bnei Yisrael was recoiling from responsibility. The symbol of the mountain of God is that place from which responsibility emanates. The mountain makes demands, and the people respond by running away. So here Zornberg introduces another interesting psychological explanation that on its face seems paradoxical. She says that the people were not just fleeing from the law and responsibility, but they were also fleeing from the bliss that they had experienced with God and being in proximity to God. Now, on the face of this, we would wonder, why would people shy away from and flee from bliss, from this kind of ecstatic joy that had to have been part of the experience of this mystical revelation? The people were running away from the greatest pleasure in life, the delight and ecstasy of the mystical experience at Sinai, the Oneg Har Sinai. They preferred the delights of the flesh, the taste of meat, which metaphor also has a sexual connotation. In fact, one midrash talks about the people missing the pleasure of the forbidden sexual relationships. If you remember that famous midrash, which I've brought as part of my teaching, and the rabbi has also, the midrash about God going around to the various nations and offering Torah to them, and they all rejected them before it was offered to the Israelites. So when Torah was offered to the nations of Ammon and Moab, they turned it down. They asked, what are the laws of Torah? What's contained in it? When they heard that immorality was one of its main prohibitions, they said, our national origins are bound up with a story of immorality between Lot's daughters and their father. That immorality has become part and parcel of our national character. So for that reason, they rejected Torah. So it seems the Israelites are going through a similar crisis here, perhaps buyer's remorse. The other times that they had expressed regret about leaving Egypt were before the revelation at Sinai. A big difference here is that these new complaints are especially troubling because they occur after the revelation. So what is the ambivalence about craving and rejecting bliss? Well, Zornberg tries to explain this. The state of bliss is derived from closeness to God, and there's an element of danger to it. Think of the conversation Moshe had with God, asking for God to reveal more of God's self and to come closer. Moshe wants more, even though more is fraught with danger. But the people's fear counteracts their desire for more and causes them to want less, the safety of less. Perhaps this even explains why Ha'adam and Chava taste of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, an act that can be seen as a rejection of Gan Eden. The collective fear even results in loss of self-awareness, meaning the people don't display an understanding about their own behavior, but we readers can try to psychoanalyze, which is what Zornberg does beautifully in all of her books. The complaint about missing meat goes against the understanding that the manna had the ability to taste like anything that we desired. The complaint about eating all the exotic delicacies for free in Egypt is another narrative falsehood. In fact, the only experience of eating for free was the Israelite experience of manna. How ironic is that? Free here really means free from mitzvot and responsibility, but the people could not confront this truth about themselves. And if some could, they were ashamed to say it. So they hid behind these false pretexts, and they substituted a false narrative for the truth. So why do people turn away from the manna, rejecting the manna? Well, one way is to explain that rejecting the manna is just like rejecting faith. And coincidentally, the shorash of manna and the Hebrew word for faith, which is emunah, is a shared shorash. There's a common root to both of them. So there's an element of faith, obviously, that goes with manna, trusting that God will provide this food daily and provide twice as much on Friday so that there's sufficient for Shabbat. What the people are really rejecting here, and this is the root of what Zornberg is trying to explain, is that they're rejecting uncertainty. Now, I've taught many times about the importance of embracing a particular type of discomfort rather than running away from it. Our instinct is to run away from something that is uncomfortable or unknown or causes a dis-ease. The people cannot live in a cloud of unknowing. Now, interestingly enough, this term cloud of unknowing comes from the title of a book by a 14th century English Christian mystic who tried to explain what was the path to knowing God. And one of the things that he said was, you have to abandon consideration of God's particular attributes and activities. You have to be courageous enough to surrender your intellect and ego. In other words, to put intellect and ego aside and surrender to this experience of unknowing, which can feel extremely uncomfortable. There can almost be a physical aspect of it, that the ground is shifting beneath you. And obviously, there's an element of comfort in predictability. But if you embrace that to the exclusion of this unknowing, you'll miss out on some of the superlatives, including becoming a God knower. So this mystic said that when we put aside intellect and ego for the realm of unknowing, that's when we can begin to glimpse into the nature of God. And that experience can only be within a cloud of unknowing, motivated by this yearning and wanting to be close, a desire to be a God knower, a desire to love God and experience God's love. But the key is, according to this mystic, and according really to what Zornberg is also explaining, this access is through this unknowing darkness. The darkness and cloud are between us and God, but rather than see it as a barrier, it really is a portal. So the barrier ultimately instead is intellect and reason. The unknowing creates the portal. So Zornberg extends some of these ideas and says that without doubt and mystery, you cannot experience this bliss. You cannot come closer to this realm that God occupies and have this direct mystical experience. She goes on to explain that the moment you need to have no doubt about the mystical experience, that is when the experience is lost. In other words, the moment you need to know with certainty, without any doubt about any aspect of what you are experiencing in a particular moment, that is when the experience ends, because the experience has to include an aspect of doubt and mystery. She goes on to give an example from the Romantic poet John Keats, who also expressed something similar. He believed that when a person is open to life, that they can tolerate and exist this state of doubt, which includes particular absence of facts and reason, that knowledge, in fact, can defeat experience, because the moment you need to absolutely know something, the immediate experience ends because you won't allow it to happen. So this paradox is very interesting. And this Romantic poet, this 14th century Christian mystic, and Zornberg are all trying to give us a roadmap of what to embrace and what to reject when we want to come closer to this mystical experience. Keats goes on to say that an artist, and that includes all of us, so don't feel excluded by that title, that an artist must be willing to expose the self and open the apertures to what we don't understand, and then the possibilities are infinite. Additionally, Paul Tillich, and Rabbi Finley has spoken many times in a great length about Paul Tillich. He in one of his books, The Courage to Be, says that courage does not remove anxiety. And here's another key instruction of how to get from there to here. Courage does not remove anxiety, so that the goal of being courage should not be having no anxiety and having no fear. Courage can help us accept the inevitable anxiety of new experiences. And courage can help us find a context. Unmitigated anxiety, however, can destroy experiences, such as the experience of the revelation, which I mentioned before, when the Israelites rejected this direct experience of God and asked Moshe to be the mediator. So for example, and here's another interesting synchronicity, our sages teach us that at the exact moment that God gave the tablets to Moshe at the top of the mountain, at the top of Mount Sinai, that is the exact moment that the people were also building the golden calf. So remember that that part of the definition of the midbar, the wilderness, is the chaotic unknown factor. And it was necessary for all of us to go through the wilderness in order to transform into who we needed to be for the next chapter of our lives. All of this helps to explain the people's fear and anxiety, leading to their complaints. But the antidote is given. It's difficult, but doable. Understanding and anticipating that new situations will cause crises of doubt and faith, and that courage may be very hard to find. Living with the uncertainty and unknowing, however, can open a portal to new experiences, including the experience of God and the experience of bliss. Shabbat Shalom.